Hello viewers! Today you're going to see a 4-stage sake recipe. I've been brewing rice wine with this koji. I made doburoku with part of the koji in this video. And this was the recipe I used in that video. Wanted to show you the recipe here so you can see how simple it was. I used 500 grams of sweet rice and 150 grams of that koji. And it took 12 days, and I filtered and bottled it. That recipe worked out well. But today you're going to see a much more complex recipe. So here's where I got this recipe. It's from byo.com. The author of the recipe is Bob Taylor. And there's just a lot more to explain in this recipe. And I'm going to take a few moments to go over things here. I've written out all the steps day by day as I understand it. And I've scaled the recipe to the amount of koji that I have. And I've tried to note where I've made modifications to the original recipe. I'm going to go through all of these steps in detail in the rest of the video. And of course, like I always ask myself, is this rustic? And the verdict is no, this is not rustic. This is too complicated to be rustic. Just to help with understanding, here's a summary of the 4 stages. The amount of water, koji, and rice for each of the 4 stages and the day that each stage starts. The top section is what I plan to do, and during the course of brewing, I had to make some adjustments, and on the bottom is the amount of ingredients I actually used in the day the stage actually began. There are some notable procedures in this recipe. First of all, this recipe adds koji to the rice early and allows the koji to soak before adding yeast or the rice in the next stage. And after steaming rice, this recipe uses cold water to cool it down instead of letting it cool to room temperature slowly. The first stage is long, the second stage is short, third stage is very short, and the fourth stage is very long. And there's very detailed temperature control. We're supposed to have it at 20 degrees Celsius for 2 days, 10 degrees Celsius for 12 hours, and back up to 20 for 6 days, down for 5 days, up for 4 days, and then down for 3 weeks. That was the plan anyhow. And I'm going to show you a little diagram of what that looks like. And the diagram shows you, the dashes show the higher temperature and the underscores show the lower temperature, and the time moves from left to right. The numbers show you the state when each stage happens, 1, 2, 3, 4. That looks pretty complicated. And beyond that, there are 3 additives that we're using in this recipe. We're using yeast nutrient, epsom salt, and salt substitute. These provide urea, diammonium phosphate, magnesium sulfate, and potassium chloride. And all of these are meant to improve yeast activity and produce more alcohol in the end. I think these additives are another reason why this brew is not a rustic brew. However, these additives are commonly used in beer brewing, for example, and I think this recipe comes from that perspective of beer brewing. So I think that explains why some of the things are done the way they are in this recipe. It's because of that beer brewing perspective. And I also want to say that even though this recipe is complex, it won't duplicate refined Japanese sake. For one thing, I'm using normal sweet rice, not the special kind of sake rice. I'm using rice that's normally milled instead of rice that's milled a lot, down to, say, 70% or 50% of the original size. and I'm not using sake yeast. That's just to set my expectations. I can't expect to make refined Japanese sake with this recipe. But enough with the introductory remarks for this recipe. Let's brew. Like I said, I'm going to show you every step on the evening prior to the first day of brewing, day 0. Wash 75 grams of sweet rice and soak overnight. This is more than 75 grams. I'm combining this with another project just to make it practical so I don't have to wash such a small amount of rice. And of course, that's because I only have a small amount of koji, and I scaled the recipe down to match the amount of koji that I had, and that meant that this first stage is very small. 75 grams is really a small amount of rice. Next step is to mix 100 milliliters of water and 2 of the nutrients, the yeast nutrient and the epsom salt, and 25 grams of koji. So the koji is dried koji that I was able to buy this on Amazon. So we're pre-soaking the koji, putting it in the fridge. The next day, which I'm going to call day 0, I steam the rice. I'm steaming for 40 minutes. That's my usual procedure. And instead of cooling this, immediately I'm going to remove the proportion corresponding to the 75 grams. And I'm putting that pretty hot rice in the fermentation jar, and I'm going to mix it with the cold water mixture, koji, and the nutrient. Usually I would mix this by hand, and this is so small, I'm going to mix it with one finger. Okay, so it's mixed well now, and we're supposed to keep it around 20 degrees Celsius. And stir it. It's a little too warm in the kitchen. I'm going to move it to the basement. And I am stirring it twice on day 0. And the next day, stir it twice again. It smells sweet. There's no yeast added so far, so it's not fermenting. This stage is just some conversion of starch to sugar. Then on day 2, I want to move it to 10 degrees Celsius. So I've turned this fridge to around that temperature, and now we're going to add the yeast. So a 1/4 teaspoon of my wine yeast, and stir that, and leave it in the fridge at that low temperature, 10 degrees, for 12 hours. So this is unlike what I normally do. So keep it at this lower temperature for 12 hours in the fridge, and then move it out of the fridge. Then for the next 3 days, stir it twice a day, in the morning and the evening. Now it does have a fruity aroma. I see small bubbles, so it is fermenting, even though it's such a small amount at the bottom of the jar here. So that's a good sign that something is happening. Seems on track so far. And for the next 3 days, just stir it once a day. And now for 5 days, we're going to move it back to the fridge to stay cool. I think the idea here is to produce some lactic acid bacteria action in this, and that's desirable. But I get lactic acid bacteria in my makgeolli brewing, and I don't do this procedure. This is a much more complex procedure. Just checking the temperature, it looks okay. The evening of the last day of rest, add 45 grams of koji to the jar, and don't drop in this packet of desiccant by mistake when you're measuring. So adding 45 grams of koji to the jar. This is part of the second stage, but we haven't added the rice of the second stage yet, just adding the koji. So that's part of the procedure here, adding the koji early. So that same evening, wash 125 grams of sweet rice and soak overnight. And again, I'm combining this rice with another brewing project. So this is more than 125 grams. After the rice is washed, soak it overnight. Original recipe says to soak it in the fridge. Then the next morning, mix 150 milliliters of warm water and a quarter teaspoon of salt substitute. This is for potassium chloride, and then chill that water in the fridge. So again, this is supposed to be good for the yeast. I want to steam the rice. This is the stage 2 rice. And when we're done steaming, mix in the chilled water with the potassium chloride. Mix it up well, and once it's cooled below 30 degrees Celsius, add it to the jar. Then keep it at 20 degrees and stir it every 2 hours for 12 hours. And I'm just leaving the lid loose here. The basement is around 20 degrees. So stir it every 2 hours. The problem here is that there's no yeast activity. I saw the bubbles before, but now they're gone. So I'm going to add more yeast. So I mixed some yeast into warm water and added it to the jar. So I'm trying to rescue this because I noticed there was no more yeast activity. The whole point of doing this was to build up a lot of yeast in this early stage. So this step is not in the original recipe. This is just my attempt to rescue the brew. So the next day, stir it 3 times, trying to get it back on track with this brew. So it has liquefied, and now there is yeast activity again. And the next day, stir it twice. I'm leaving this for an extra day, not in the original recipe, just to let the yeast reproduce some more. Then that evening, add 60 grams of koji to the jar and stir. So this is the koji for the 3rd stage, letting it soak 1 day early. And of course, we have to prepare the rice for the 3rd stage. 300 grams of sweet rice. And this is more than 300 grams because I'm combining this rice with another brewing project. So the problem with having to do a 4-stage recipe is that you have to be steaming rice often. So the rice is washed and soak it overnight. The next day, chill 450 milliliters of water, and now we're 1 day behind from the original recipe. We're going to steam this rice and mix in the chilled water. We're just steaming rice all the time now to get to deal with this 4-stage recipe. So this is stage 3. This is the rice for stage 3, and I'm going to mix in the chilled water and separate all the grains of rice. Now it's cooled down to below 30 degrees and add it to the jar and stir. So each stage is getting larger. Starts off with a small amount of rice, then slightly more, and now even more. So now we have a substantial amount of rice in the jar. Then on the morning of the next day, add 145 grams of koji to the jar and stir. This was done 36 hours earlier in the original recipe. I just allowed extra time to do my yeast problem earlier. I was planning to add 125 grams, but I just used the rest of the package, so there was an extra 20 grams in there. This is the koji for the final stage, for stage 4. We're adding it earlier to allow the koji to soak in the liquid. So it gets a head start the enzymes get a head start. And then that same morning, I'm going to wash 500 grams of sweet rice, and I'm going to soak that 6 hours. So a lot of steps here. Now chill 700 milliliters of water. The original recipe used 900, but I already added 100 milliliters of extra water, and I have to be careful that I don't overflow the jar. So this is the rice for stage 4. We're going to steam that. When it's done steaming, we're going to mix in the cold water into the rice. So this is the stage 4 rice. This is the final stage. And when it cools down, I'm going to add it to the jar now, carefully. And you see the jar is filling up. The jar is at maximum capacity. Yes, I really couldn't have added the full amount of water here. I have to allow for some expansion at the top. So I decided to ferment it at 20 degrees. Because last time I brought the temperature down to 10 degrees, it seemed to stop the yeast activity. Maybe my yeast isn't as cold tolerant as I thought. So I'm changing the original recipe here. I'm fermenting at a higher temperature, so it's going to take less time. The original recipe said to ferment for 3 weeks, and I ended up fermenting for only 10 more days at the 20 degrees. I kept an eye on it, kept smelling it. You can see that it rapidly separated into layers here. The top cap, the middle liquid layer, and then some rice at the bottom. And slowly the rice falls down from the top layer to the bottom layer. And also over time, the liquid layer is becoming more clear and yellow. So it is progressing. I'm going to bottle it day 28. Original recipe would have filtered and bottled on day 38. It does pour out very easily into the filter bag. You can see it dripping out there already, and I'm going to gently squeeze it. Not difficult at all. Quite easy to filter this. $254 grams of lees here. Very, very soft. The rice broke down well. That looks good. Now the easy part, just get it in the bottles. A little under 2.5 liters output for this recipe. And I'm going to taste it immediately after bottling. But of course, I'm going to reserve my judgment for a few days. I am going to let it sit in the fridge for 4 days and judge it at that point after it's cooled down and settled a bit. So this recipe was more complex. We learned some new techniques, some new procedures. So we're going to jump ahead to that tasting in just a minute. But before that, I hope you enjoyed the fact that we were able to try out some new procedures, soaking the koji early, adding cold water to hot rice to cool it down rapidly. We got to use all these additives to try to help out our yeast, even though it didn't seem to work at the beginning because I had low yeast activity. I had to add extra yeast in the middle. Anyhow, let's jump ahead to the tasting. It's been 4 days since I bottled this complex sake recipe. Notice how well it has settled. It's only about 10% of sediment at the bottom. It does feel like there's quite a bit of gas in this. So I'm going to open this a little carefully. Okay, just a small amount. I'm actually going to drink from the other bottle. I'm going to pour off the clear layer. So I'm going to drink the clear layer. It's not perfectly clear, but it's only been 4 days though. I want to see what this tastes like. Okay, it smells a little fruity. I do smell alcohol too. And some of that bitterness. Okay, a lot of things. It also smells. I smell some sweetness too. So. Oh, but pretty dry taste. Yeah, I don't taste a lot of sweetness. It's quite astringent. I feel it all around my mouth. It ends with some bitterness too. Now that might be that dead yeast bitterness you can get from maybe from the first batch of yeast that didn't make it. Okay, I wouldn't say this tastes like sake though. It doesn't taste like refined sake, but it's quite dry. The fermentation really did work. It tastes pretty strong. Ended with quite dry, astringent brew, some bitterness at the end. Yeah, so, okay, so this is very interesting. I don't usually get a brew like this. This did produce something different. Just the taste is not, I'm not sure if the taste was worth the effort though. But it's not terrible. I got a good fermentation out of this, quite a bit of alcohol, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of sugar left over. You know, it's a worthwhile experiment. It does have flavor. It's not bland. It's just not it's probably not the kind of refined sake flavor you might expect, and it was quite a bit of effort to brew this, and like I mentioned earlier, it just it wasn't rustic from the start. We tried a lot of different techniques in this recipe that were that were not the rustic techniques, the additives, the temperature control back and forth, that those aren't really rustic techniques. Maybe it's growing on me a bit. There's an interesting initial flavor. So that fruitiness is good. That's a positive aspect of the flavor. And assume the defects are due to my problems with my initial batch of yeast. It seemed like it was working, but then seemed to become inactive later, so I had to add more yeast. So that, I'm sure that adversely affected the flavor. So don't blame Bob Taylor for that. There's definitely a lot more I can learn about this kind of complex recipe. I tried to explain. It did take a lot more effort to explain the recipe this time, and but I hope you found it interesting. Got to try something new, and let me know in the comments what you think. Thank you for watching.